What does it take to transform ridicule into respect on a battlefield where every second could be your last? When fellow soldiers mock your unconventional tactics and question your methods, how do you prove that innovation born from desperation can be deadlier than tradition? In the frozen hell of World War I's Western Front, one British sniper would answer these questions in the most definitive way possible. With 9 German bodies sprawled in the mud and snow, each killed with a single, perfectly placed shot in just 6 minutes of methodical, ruthless efficiency. This is the story of a marksman whose ingenuity under fire turned a crude observation slit cut into a cattle shed into one of the most effective sniper positions on the British line. It is a tale of how mockery turned to awe, how improvisation defeated doctrine, and how one man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom resulted in a display of shooting prowess that would become legendary among British snipers. In an age when trench warfare had reduced combat to grinding attrition and anonymous slaughter, this sniper proved that individual skill, properly applied, could still tip the scales. The Western Front was a place where innovation often meant survival, and where those who clung too rigidly to established methods frequently paid with their lives. The sniper who cut that cattle shed Slit understood this fundamental truth, and his willingness to experiment, to adapt, and to see possibilities where others saw only limitations would make him a ghost that haunted the German trenches opposite his position. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, those who had laughed would understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a master craftsman at work, turning the tools of war into instruments of precision death. The Western Front in the winter of 1917 was a nightmare landscape that defied description. From the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, 2 massive armies faced each other across a devastated no-man's land of mud, wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead. The war that politicians had promised would be over by Christmas 1914 had devolved into a grinding stalemate that consumed lives by the hundreds of thousands for gains measured in yards. The trenches stretched for over 400 miles, and every foot of that distance was contested with a savagery that shocked even hardened veterans. By 1917, the war had been raging for 3 brutal years. The great offensives of 1916, Verdun and the Somme, had demonstrated the horrific cost of attempting to break through fortified positions with massed infantry attacks. Hundreds of thousands had died for negligible territorial gains, and both sides had learned harsh lessons about the realities of modern warfare. The machine gun, barbed wire, and artillery had created a defensive advantage so overwhelming that traditional offensive tactics had become tantamount to suicide. In this context, snipers had emerged as one of the few weapons that could inflict damage on the enemy without requiring suicidal charges across no man's land. A skilled marksman with a good rifle and a protected position could kill officers, destroy morale, and dominate sections of the front line. The British Army had been slow to recognize the value of sniping compared to the Germans, who had entered the war with trained marksmen and specialized equipment. By 1915, however, the British had begun to develop their own sniper program, recruiting men with hunting experience, gamekeepers, and target shooting champions. The British sniper schools taught marksmanship, fieldcraft, camouflage, and the psychological aspects of killing from concealment. Students learned to read the terrain, to identify enemy positions from the smallest clues, to estimate range accurately, and to account for wind, temperature, and the peculiarities of their weapons. They learned patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours waiting for a target, and the discipline to take only shots they were certain of making. Most importantly, they learned to think independently and to use their initiative to find and exploit opportunities. The curriculum at these schools was comprehensive and demanding. Trainees spent hours on rifle ranges, learning to shoot accurately at various distances under different conditions. They practiced estimating range by eye, a critical skill when precise measurements were impossible. They studied ballistics, learning how bullets behaved in flight and how environmental factors affected trajectory. They learned to construct camouflaged hides, to move silently and invisibly, and to observe enemy positions for hours without being detected. The washout rate was high because the standards were exacting, and only those who demonstrated exceptional aptitude graduated. Beyond technical skills, the schools emphasized the mental discipline required for effective sniping. Instructors taught students to control their breathing and heart rate, to manage the stress of being under enemy observation, and to make split-second decisions about when to shoot and when to hold fire. They learned to suppress the natural human reluctance to kill, to view their targets as tactical problems rather than human beings. This psychological conditioning was necessary because hesitation on the battlefield meant death, either for the sniper or for the soldiers he was supposed to protect. The sniper, whose story we tell here, was a product of this training, but he brought something more to his craft, an innovative mind that refused to accept conventional limitations. His name has been lost to history, as many sniper records were deliberately kept vague to protect the identities of men whose effectiveness made them priority targets for enemy snipers. What we know of him comes from the recollections of his fellow soldiers, from unit war diaries that recorded his achievements without naming him, and from the oral tradition of British sniping that passed his story down through generations of marksmen. He had been a gamekeeper in civilian life, a profession that had given him an intimate knowledge of rifles, fieldcraft, and the patient stalking of wary prey. He understood concealment instinctively, knew how to move without being seen, and possessed the steady nerves required to wait hours for a single shot. His employer before the war had been a wealthy landowner whose estate covered thousands of acres of forest and moorland, and the sniper had spent years managing the deer population, protecting game birds from poachers, and maintaining the delicate ecological balance that made the estate productive. This work had honed skills that would prove invaluable in warfare. He had learned to read tracks and signs that revealed animal movements, knowledge that translated directly to reading battlefield terrain for evidence of enemy activity. He had developed the patience to wait motionless in a hide for hours until a trophy stag appeared, patience that would serve him well when waiting for enemy officers to expose themselves. He had learned to shoot accurately at moving targets at considerable distances, compensating instinctively for range, wind, and the target's motion. All of these civilian skills found military application. When war came, he had enlisted immediately, driven by a sense of duty and perhaps by the knowledge that his skills would be valuable in the coming fight. He had survived the early disasters of 1914 and 1915, had fought through the Somme, and had emerged as one of the most effective snipers in his division. His service record showed steady accumulation of confirmed kills, but more importantly, it showed a pattern of tactical innovation and creative problem-solving that distinguished him from many of his peers. The sector of the line where this story unfolds was relatively quiet by Western Front standards, which meant that men died every day, but not in the thousands. It was a holding position where both sides maintained defensive postures while conserving strength for offensives elsewhere. The trenches here had been occupied for months, and both British and German soldiers knew every feature of the landscape, every firing position, every weak point in the other side's defenses. It was a chess game played with rifles and grenades, where familiarity bred both contempt and caution. The German forces opposite this sector included several experienced Jaeger battalions, units that specialized in marksmanship and fieldcraft. These were not conscripts fresh from training, but veteran soldiers who understood the sniper threat and took extensive precautions against it. They had their own skilled snipers, who had claimed numerous British victims, and they had developed sophisticated counter-sniper tactics that made operating from obvious positions extremely dangerous. Any British sniper who worked from a conventional hide in the front-line trenches risked discovery and death from German marksmen who were equally skilled and highly motivated. Behind the British front-line trench, perhaps 200 yards back, stood the ruins of what had once been a prosperous farm. The farmhouse itself had been reduced to rubble by artillery fire, but one outbuilding, a cattle shed constructed of thick stone walls, remained partially intact. Most soldiers gave it little thought beyond using it occasionally as shelter from the weather or as a place to heat rations out of sight of enemy observers. The building seemed too exposed, too obvious to have any tactical value. German artillery had knocked holes in the roof and walls, and it appeared to offer no advantages over the established observation posts closer to the front line. The area around the farm bore the scars of years of warfare. Shell craters pockmarked the ground, some filled with stagnant water that froze solid in the winter cold. The remnants of barbed wire entanglements lay scattered about, rusted and partially buried. The ground itself had been churned and rechurned by explosions, until the original topsoil had mixed with subsoil to create a sterile, lifeless mud that supported no vegetation. In summer, this mud became a viscous morass that could swallow a man. In winter, it froze into iron-hard ruts and ridges that made movement treacherous. The sniper saw the cattle shed differently. He studied it with a professional eye, noting its construction, its sightlines, and its relationship to the German positions across no man's land. He observed that while the building was visible from the German trenches, it was far enough back that the Germans likely dismissed it as irrelevant. The damage it had sustained actually worked in its favor, making it appear completely ruined and uninhabitable. Most importantly, the thick stone walls that remained would stop rifle bullets and provide excellent protection for a concealed firing position. What caught his attention most was a section of wall facing the German lines that had partially collapsed, creating a gap about 18 inches high and perhaps 2 feet wide. To most observers, this was simply battle damage, another scar in a landscape covered with them. But the sniper recognized it as a natural loophole, a firing port that could be refined and used to observe and engage German positions without exposing himself to return fire. The height was nearly perfect, requiring only minor modification to create an ideal shooting position. The angle of view from the cattle shed was particularly advantageous. Because the position was elevated slightly on a gentle rise and set back from the front line, it provided a perspective on the German trenches that was different from any observation post in the British lines. Sections of the German position that were completely concealed from the front line trenches were partially visible from the cattle shed due to this different angle. The sniper recognized that this geometric advantage could allow him to engage targets that were effectively invulnerable to fire from conventional positions. The sniper's plan was simple, but required careful execution. He would improve the natural loophole in the cattle shed wall, creating what snipers called a firing slit that would allow him to observe and shoot while remaining almost completely concealed. The challenge was to make the modifications subtle enough that German observers would not notice the change. Any obvious alteration to the building's appearance would draw attention and potentially artillery fire that would destroy his position before he could use it. Working at night and in the early morning hours when mist provided additional concealment, the sniper began his modifications. He carefully shaped the existing gap, using rubble and stones to narrow it in places and to create a rest for his rifle. He worked with deliberate slowness, moving only small amounts of material each night to avoid creating obvious changes that might be noticed during daylight German observation. He studied the building from various angles to ensure that his modifications blended seamlessly with the existing damage pattern. He darkened the interior of the shed by hanging blankets and canvas well back from the firing slit, ensuring that no reflection or movement inside would be visible from outside. This interior screening was critical because the human eye naturally detects contrasts, and a dark hole in a light-colored wall immediately draws attention. By ensuring that the interior matched the general darkness of shadowed damage elsewhere in the structure, he made his firing slit indistinguishable from dozens of other gaps and holes in the ruined building. He created multiple positions within the shed so he could vary his firing point and avoid establishing a pattern that German snipers could exploit. One position was at ground level, another was accessed by climbing onto debris to gain additional height, and a third was positioned to shoot through a different gap entirely. This flexibility would allow him to engage targets from slightly different angles and would prevent the Germans from pinpointing his exact location, even if they determined generally that fire was coming from the cattle shed area. The interior arrangement was crucial. He positioned sandbags to create a comfortable shooting rest at exactly the right height. These sandbags were filled with soil excavated from inside the building so that no fresh dirt would be visible outside to betray his work. He ensured he had clear retreat routes if the position came under fire, identifying paths through the rubble that would allow him to exit quickly without exposing himself to enemy observation. He stored ammunition within easy reach and organized his equipment so everything was exactly where he needed it. He even brought in a stool that allowed him to sit comfortably while observing, conserving his strength for the moments when shooting opportunities presented themselves. Long-duration observation was physically demanding, and the ability to remain alert and focused for hours required minimizing physical discomfort. The stool was positioned so he could sit with his eye at the proper height to observe through the firing slit without having to maintain an awkward or tiring posture. Every detail was considered and prepared with meticulous care. He brought water and basic rations so he could remain in position throughout the day without having to leave for meals. He prepared a waste bucket so he would not have to exit the position for calls of nature. He even considered the direction of the sun at different times of day, ensuring that his firing slit would not be backlit in a way that would silhouette him to German observers. The preparation was exhaustive because he understood that success in sniping depended as much on avoiding detection as on accurate shooting. When he showed his work to fellow snipers in his unit, their reaction was less than enthusiastic. The position seemed too exposed, too far from the front line, and too obvious. They pointed out that the Germans must have the building ranged for artillery fire, and that using it as a sniper position was inviting disaster. Some mocked the crude appearance of the firing slit, calling it a cattle shed sniper slit with contempt, suggesting that it looked like amateur work rather than professional preparation. They questioned whether anyone could make effective shots at the ranges involved, roughly 400 to 500 yards to the German trenches. The derision was particularly sharp from snipers who had attended the formal training schools and who prided themselves on their professional expertise. They viewed the cattle shed position as violating fundamental principles they had been taught. Sniper positions should be close to the target to maximize accuracy, they argued. Positions should be in the frontline trenches where observation was best. Working from such an exposed building in the rear was contrary to all established doctrine and was likely to result in nothing but wasted effort and possibly injury or death. The criticism stung, but the sniper had confidence in his analysis. He understood something his critics had missed. The Germans had become accustomed to the appearance of the damaged cattle shed and had stopped paying attention to it. By working within the existing damage pattern, rather than creating something obviously new, he had achieved a level of camouflage that purpose-built loopholes in the trench line could never match. The Germans were watching the British trenches for signs of sniper activity, but they were not watching a ruined building hundreds of yards behind the lines. The ranges involved did present challenges. At 400 to 500 yards, accurate shooting required excellent marksmanship, intimate knowledge of one's rifle, and the ability to read environmental conditions. Wind could push a bullet several inches off target at that distance. Temperature affected the ammunition's performance, with cold weather increasing powder density and thus muzzle velocity. Mirage from ground heat could distort the image in the scope, making precise aiming difficult. But the sniper had trained for precisely these challenges, and his experience as a gamekeeper had taught him to make difficult shots at extended ranges. His rifle was a Lee Enfield No. 1 Memke 3 fitted with a periscopic prism company sight, one of the better telescopic sights available to British snipers at that time. The PP company scope offered 3-power magnification and was relatively robust compared to earlier optical sights that had proven fragile under field conditions. The scope was mounted offset to the left of the rifle's centerline to clear the bolt action, a mounting system that required the shooter to adjust for parallax at different ranges, but which allowed for faster reloading than top-mounted scopes. He had spent hours familiarizing himself with this specific rifle, learning its peculiarities and how it shot under different conditions. He knew that it tended to shoot slightly high in cold weather due to the increased powder performance, and that it favored the right at ranges beyond 400 yards, probably due to a slight asymmetry in the barrel or stock bedding. He had logged these characteristics in a small notebook he carried, creating a personal reference that helped him make accurate first-round hits. The notebook contained detailed observations about how many clicks of scope adjustment were needed at various ranges, how different wind speeds affected bullet drift, and what holdovers were required when shooting uphill or downhill. The sniper also understood the importance of observation. Before he ever fired a shot from his new position, he spent days simply watching the German trenches through his scope, learning their routines and identifying their positions. He noted when sentries changed, observing that the Germans rotated guards every 2 hours during daylight and every hour during darkness. He identified where men tended to congregate, spotting areas where soldiers gathered to smoke or to receive rations. He marked which sections of trench seemed most active and which were quiet, information that suggested where headquarters and supply points might be located. He identified what appeared to be command posts based on the traffic of runners and the presence of telephone lines. German communication trenches were visible at certain angles, and he noted which ones seemed to carry the most traffic, suggesting they connected important positions. He observed the routines of German working parties that emerged at dawn and dusk to repair wire obstacles and to improve their trenches, noting the timing and locations of this activity. All of this information was carefully recorded in his notebook, creating an intelligence picture that would guide his targeting decisions. He marked the locations of German sniper positions, recognizing them by subtle signs that less experienced observers would miss. A barely visible loophole in a sandbagged parapet, a suspicious shadow that never changed despite shifting light conditions, a section of trench where British soldiers had been shot, suggested the presence of an enemy marksman. He studied these positions carefully, looking for patterns in when they were occupied and identifying the specific firing ports the German snipers favored. This knowledge would help him avoid their attention when he began his own shooting. This patient observation was the mark of a professional sniper. Amateurs were impatient, eager to shoot at any target that presented itself. Professionals understood that the best opportunities came from understanding enemy patterns and anticipating where and when targets would appear. The sniper was building a mental map of the German positions opposite him, identifying the high-value targets and the locations where men routinely exposed themselves, often not realizing they were visible from positions far behind the British lines. He also studied the light conditions at different times of day. Morning light came from behind the German positions, silhouetting anyone who stood up in the trenches and making them clearly visible against the bright eastern sky. Late afternoon sun shone directly into the German lines from the west, forcing sentries to squint and reducing their ability to spot threats. Overcast days provided flat light that eliminated shadows and made judging distance more difficult. Each condition presented different opportunities and challenges, and the sniper catalogued them all in his methodical preparation. He paid particular attention to atmospheric conditions that affected visibility and shooting. Morning mist that filled the lower ground could provide concealment for movement, but made long-range shooting impossible. The clear, cold air of winter mornings provided excellent visibility, but also made sounds carry farther, increasing the risk that the report of his rifle would betray his position. Wind patterns varied throughout the day, with calm conditions typically prevailing at dawn before breezes developed as the sun warmed the ground. All of these observations informed his planning about when and under what conditions to shoot. His comrades continued to mock the cattle shed position, calling it a waste of time and predicting that he would accomplish nothing beyond drawing German artillery fire onto the area. Some made jokes about him hiding in a barn like a farmer rather than fighting like a soldier. Others suggested that he was simply looking for a comfortable place to shirk his duties, implying that the elaborate preparations were really just an excuse to avoid the dangers and discomforts of serving in the front-line trenches. The criticism revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of sniper craft among many infantry soldiers, who saw snipers as men who took pot shots from trenches rather than as specialists who employed carefully developed tactics and positions. This lack of understanding sometimes created friction between snipers and regular infantry, with the infantry viewing snipers as having an easy job hiding in the rear, while real soldiers faced the daily dangers of trench duty. The snipers, for their part, resented the implication that their work was not genuine combat, knowing that their mission was both dangerous and tactically vital. The sniper ignored the mockery and continued his preparations. He knew that results would silence critics more effectively than arguments. He planned his first shooting session carefully, waiting for conditions that would give him the best chance of success. He wanted clear weather for good visibility, but not bright sun that would cause his scope to reflect light and potentially betray his position. He wanted calm winds so he could predict bullet trajectory accurately without having to account for complex wind deflection. And he wanted a time when German activity was likely to be high, giving him multiple targets and the opportunity to demonstrate the position's full potential. The morning he chose for his first serious work from the cattle shed position dawned cold and grey, with clouds providing diffuse light that was ideal for observation without glare. A light wind blew from the west, steady enough to be predictable, but not strong enough to make shooting difficult. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to keep the mud firm but not so cold that his hands would be stiff and clumsy on the rifle. The sniper entered the shed well before dawn, settling into his prepared position and beginning his observation as the light increased. Through his scope, the German trenches gradually came into focus as dawn brightened. The sniper watched patiently, his rifle resting on its sandbag support, his breathing slow and controlled. He was looking for patterns, for the movements that would tell him where men would appear and when. He saw smoke rising from several points in the German line, indicating braziers where soldiers were heating food or warming themselves. These areas would draw men, and men who were cold and hungry often became careless about exposing themselves. The routine of trench life created predictable patterns that skilled observers could exploit. Men relieving themselves in designated latrine areas, soldiers carrying rations forward from rear positions, sentries being relieved after their watch periods. All of these activities created moments of exposure that a patient sniper could anticipate. The sniper had studied these patterns during his observation period, and now he watched for the specific behaviors he had learned to expect at this hour of the morning. The first target appeared around 7 in the morning, precisely when the sniper had anticipated, based on his previous observations. A German soldier emerged from a dugout entrance and stood at the parapet, stretching and looking out across no man's land. He was perhaps 450 yards away, clearly visible in the sniper's scope despite the distance. The man seemed relaxed, confident in the distance from the British trenches, and probably unaware that anyone could see him clearly from so far back. He lingered at the parapet, perhaps enjoying a morning cigarette, and the sniper recognized the posture of a man who felt safe. The sniper settled his crosshairs on the target's chest, accounting for the range and the light wind. He had calculated that at 450 yards, he needed to hold approximately 6 inches high to compensate for bullet drop, and the gentle westerly breeze required perhaps 2 inches of left hold to counteract wind drift. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. His finger took up the slack in the trigger, and in the pause between heartbeats, he fired. The rifle's report echoed across the position, and through the scope, the sniper saw the German soldier collapse. The range meant there was a perceptible delay between the shot and the impact, but the result was unmistakable. The man went down and did not move. First blood to the cattle shed position. Within 2 minutes, another target presented itself. A German soldier appeared at almost the same spot, probably an NCO or officer checking on the man who had fallen. He bent over the body briefly, then stood and looked around, trying to determine where the shot had come from. He was searching the British trenches, scanning the frontline positions where he expected sniper fire to originate, never imagining that the threat came from hundreds of yards behind them. The sniper fired again, and the second German fell beside the first. 2 shots, 2 kills, and the Germans still had not identified the source of the fire. The sniper's position was proving even more effective than he had anticipated. The Germans were conditioned to expect sniper fire from the trenches, and they were searching for muzzle flash and scope reflection in the wrong places. The distance and angle from the cattle shed meant that the sound of the shots was difficult to locate precisely, echoing off terrain features and dissipating before German observers could pinpoint its origin. The damaged appearance of the building provided perfect camouflage for the firing slit, making it indistinguishable from the dozens of other gaps and holes that pockmarked the structure. Everything was working exactly as planned. More targets appeared over the next few minutes as German soldiers reacted to the casualties. Men rushed to aid the fallen, officers emerged to assess the situation, and each exposure provided the sniper with another opportunity. He worked methodically, taking his time between shots to ensure accurate aim and to avoid establishing a rhythm that might help the Germans predict his next shot. Each time he fired, another German soldier fell. The precision was surgical, the efficiency devastating. A German medical orderly appeared, identifiable by the Red Cross armband he wore. The sniper immediately shifted his aim away from this target, adhering to the unwritten rules that prohibited shooting medical personnel. The orderly worked frantically to reach the wounded men, and the sniper allowed him to work unmolested, even though he presented an easy shot. This restraint was not mercy, but rather professional ethics. Violating the conventions regarding medical personnel would have invited reciprocal violations that would ultimately harm everyone. However, when an officer appeared, clearly attempting to organize a response and directing men to firing positions from which they might locate the sniper, the marksman did not hesitate. Officers were legitimate targets whose death would have tactical impact beyond the simple casualty count, and this one was actively working to counter the British sniper's effectiveness. The shot was slightly more difficult because the officer was moving, but the sniper led him properly and the bullet found its mark. The officer went down, and the organization he had been attempting to impose on the chaotic situation dissolved as the men lost their leader. By the time 6 minutes had elapsed from his first shot, 9 German soldiers lay dead or dying in that section of trench. The sniper had fired 9 rounds and achieved 9 hits, a display of marksmanship that would have been impressive at any range but was extraordinary at 400 to 500 yards under field conditions. Each shot had been carefully aimed, and each had found its mark with the precision that distinguished master marksmen from merely competent shooters. The Germans had no effective response because they could not locate the threat, could not direct fire at a target they could not see. The impact on the German positions was immediate and profound. Men who moments before had been moving freely in their trenches now huddled in dugouts, afraid to expose themselves. Word spread rapidly along the German line that a deadly accurate sniper was at work, and the fear that accompanied this knowledge paralyzed normal activity. The section of line that the sniper could observe from his position went almost completely quiet, as soldiers refused to expose themselves even for essential duties. The sniper had achieved what a company of infantry could not. He had effectively suppressed a significant section of the German line through pure psychological dominance. The sniper observed the results of his work with professional satisfaction. He had proven the effectiveness of his position and his tactics. More importantly, he had identified a section of the German line where officers and NCOs routinely exposed themselves, making it a productive hunting ground for future sessions. He noted in his small logbook the times when activity was highest, the spots where men appeared most frequently, and the ranges to various points of interest. This information would make subsequent shooting sessions even more effective, allowing him to anticipate target appearance and prepare firing solutions in advance. After the 9th kill, the sniper ceased fire. He knew that continuing would risk drawing artillery fire or giving the Germans time to organize a response. One of the fundamental principles of snipercraft was knowing when to stop shooting and withdraw. He had achieved spectacular results, had proven his position's value, and had inflicted significant casualties on the enemy. Continuing would risk everything for diminishing returns, and the professional sniper knew when enough was enough. He carefully cleaned his rifle, removing powder residue from the bore and ensuring that the action functioned smoothly. He secured his equipment, organizing everything for quick retrieval during his next visit to the position. He waited until full daylight had arrived and activity had resumed in both the British and German trenches before slipping out of the cattle shed, timing his departure to coincide with movement elsewhere that would distract German observers. He left no trace of his presence, no indication that the ruined building was anything other than abandoned wreckage. When he returned to British lines and word of his morning's work spread through the unit, the reaction was dramatically different from the mockery he had endured earlier. 9 confirmed kills in 6 minutes from a position everyone had dismissed as worthless had transformed him from an object of ridicule to a subject of awe. The cattle shed sniper Slit that had been mocked was now recognized as an innovative and deadly effective fighting position. Officers who had questioned his methods now sought his advice on establishing similar positions elsewhere along the line. Fellow snipers who had criticized his approach now wanted to learn his techniques and understand the thinking behind his success. The psychological impact of the sniper's achievement extended beyond simple respect for his marksmanship. He had demonstrated that unconventional approaches, when based on sound analysis and proper preparation, could achieve results that conventional methods could not match. He had shown that careful observation and preparation were more valuable than adherence to doctrine when doctrine failed to account for specific tactical situations. He had proven that individual initiative and creative thinking remained valuable even in the industrialized mass warfare of the Western Front, where individual soldiers often felt powerless in the face of artillery and machine guns that dominated the battlefield. The success of the cattle shed position led the sniper to develop a comprehensive approach to using positions far behind the front lines. He recognized that the Germans had focused their counter-sniper efforts on the trenches and the immediate area around them, creating a blind spot for threats from greater distances. By exploiting this blind spot, he could operate with relative impunity while inflicting significant casualties and psychological damage on the enemy. This recognition led him to formalize his methods into a set of principles that he shared with other snipers in his unit. His methodology involved several key principles that challenged conventional sniper doctrine. First was the importance of using existing structures and terrain rather than creating obviously new positions. Purpose-built sniper posts in the trenches could be effective, but they also drew attention and counterfire because they were obviously military installations. Natural features or damaged buildings that appeared tactically irrelevant were far safer because the enemy had learned to ignore them after weeks or months of observation without incident. The key was identifying these features and recognizing their potential value despite their unconventional nature. The sniper emphasized that successful rear area positions required specific characteristics. They needed solid construction to stop bullets, because operating without overhead cover or strong walls was suicidal. They needed sight lines that provided views of enemy positions not visible from frontline trenches, because merely duplicating existing observation capabilities provided no advantage. They needed to blend naturally with the surrounding landscape, appearing as abandoned or destroyed structures rather than as occupied military positions. And they needed to allow concealed entry and exit so the sniper could occupy and vacate them without being observed. Second was the absolute necessity of patient observation before shooting. The sniper insisted that any new position should be occupied for hours or even days, purely for observation, before a single shot was fired. This observation period served multiple purposes. It allowed the sniper to learn enemy patterns and identify high-value targets. It ensured that the position itself had not been compromised or was not under German observation, and it gave time to verify that the firing solutions calculated from maps and estimates were accurate when actually viewing the targets. The intelligence gathered during observation was often as valuable as the kills achieved through shooting. By carefully watching German positions, the sniper could identify command posts, supply routes, assembly areas, and other tactically significant locations. This information, when reported to intelligence officers, helped build a comprehensive picture of German dispositions and could inform planning for raids or larger operations. The sniper saw himself not just as a killer, but as an intelligence gatherer whose observations contributed to the broader war effort. Third was the principle of firing discipline. The sniper emphasized that every shot must count and that the temptation to engage marginal targets must be resisted. Each shot revealed the sniper's presence and gave the enemy information about his position, even if they could not pinpoint it precisely. Therefore, shots should be reserved for targets that justified the risk. Officers identifiable by their different uniforms or behavior, NCOs recognizable by their supervision of other soldiers, machine gun crews whose weapons threatened British positions, artillery observers whose direction of fire caused British casualties, and other high-value personnel whose death would have tactical impact beyond simple casualty statistics. The sniper developed a mental hierarchy of targets that guided his shooting decisions. At the top were senior officers whose death could disrupt command and control across an entire sector. Next were junior officers and senior NCOs, whose leadership directly affected the combat effectiveness of their units. Machine gun crews, mortar teams, and artillery observers ranked high because their weapon systems inflicted disproportionate casualties on British forces. Signal personnel manning telephone lines or carrying messages were valuable targets because their elimination degraded enemy communications. Ordinary soldiers, unless particularly well-positioned or performing critical tasks, ranked lowest because their loss had minimal tactical impact. Fourth was the importance of varying routines to avoid patterns. The sniper never used the cattle shed position at the same time of day twice in succession. He never fired the same number of shots or engaged targets in the same sequence. He sometimes occupied the position purely for observation without firing at all, gathering intelligence without revealing his presence. This unpredictability prevented the Germans from anticipating his activity or preparing effective countermeasures. Patterns were deadly because they allowed the enemy to predict behavior and prepare ambushes or artillery strikes, and the sniper was fanatical about avoiding them. He extended this principle to every aspect of his operations. He varied his route to and from the cattle shed, never using the same path consecutively. He occupied the position at different times of day, sometimes arriving before dawn, sometimes during mid-morning, occasionally even working at dusk. He alternated which of his prepared firing positions within the shed he used, preventing the Germans from identifying a specific loophole, even if they determined that fire was coming from the general area of the building. This obsessive attention to variation made him an unpredictable and therefore extremely difficult opponent. Fifth was the necessity of having multiple positions and rotating between them. The cattle shed was excellent, but relying on any single position was dangerous. The sniper identified and prepared several other positions at varying distances and angles from the German lines. Some days he worked from the cattle shed, other days from a shell crater closer to the lines that he had carefully camouflaged and prepared, and still other days from a position in a ruined house to the left of the sector that offered different sight lines. Each position had distinct advantages and limitations. The cattle shed offered excellent protection and concealment at the cost of longer ranges to targets. The shell crater position allowed shorter range shooting with clearer target identification, but offered minimal protection and was more easily located by German observers. The ruined house position provided an elevated view that revealed sections of German trench invisible from ground level, but required careful route planning to enter and exit without being seen. By rotating between these positions, the sniper maximized his effectiveness while minimizing the risk that the Germans could predict where he would strike next. The sniper also developed specific techniques for shooting at extended ranges that went beyond standard military marksmanship. He kept detailed records of how his rifle performed under different conditions, creating what modern snipers would call a data book. He noted that his rifle shot 2 inches high at 400 yards when the temperature was below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, probably due to the increased density of cold powder charges generating higher velocities. He recorded that a 5-mile-per-hour wind from the right required approximately 3 inches of left hold at 500 yards to compensate for drift. These observations, accumulated over dozens of shooting sessions, allowed him to make accurate first-round hits under conditions that would stump less meticulous marksmen. His data book became an invaluable reference that he consulted before every shooting session. It contained tables showing required holdovers at different ranges, wind deflection values for various wind speeds and directions, and notes about how atmospheric conditions affected his rifle's performance. He recorded the results of each shooting session, noting range, conditions, number of shots fired, and hits achieved. This systematic approach allowed him to identify trends and refine his technique continuously, improving his effectiveness over time. He also developed methods for estimating range more accurately than standard military techniques allowed. He used his scope's reticle to measure the apparent height of objects he knew the actual size of, comparing this to memorized formulas to calculate distance. A German soldier, assuming average height of 5 feet 8 inches, would subtend a specific amount of space in the reticle at different ranges. By measuring this and applying his formulas, the sniper could estimate range to within 25 yards, accurate enough for effective shooting at the distances he typically engaged. He studied the appearance of the German trenches at different ranges under various light conditions, learning to recognize 400 yards versus 500 yards from subtle visual cues. The thickness of sandbags, the visibility of details like rifle ports or periscopes, the clarity of individual soldiers' features all changed predictably with distance. By training his eye to recognize these differences, he developed an almost instinctive sense of range that supplemented his technical measurements. He even paced off distances in the British rear areas to calibrate his eye for estimating range without instruments. He would identify an object at an unknown distance, estimate how far away it was, then pace the distance to verify his estimate. Through repeated practice, his estimates became increasingly accurate, allowing him to make quick range assessments when time did not permit careful measurement with his reticle. The camouflage and concealment techniques he employed were equally sophisticated. He understood that the human eye detects movement before it recognizes shapes, so he moved with glacial slowness when in position or when approaching or leaving a position. Any rapid movement could draw the attention of German observers even at considerable distances, so he disciplined himself to move in slow motion, taking minutes to complete movements that urgency would normally accomplish in seconds. He knew that straight lines and geometric shapes attracted attention in natural landscapes, so he broke up his silhouette with irregular materials. When occupying the cattle shed, he ensured that his rifle barrel never protruded from the firing slit in a way that would create an obvious straight line visible from the German trenches. He used burlap and rough fabric to disrupt the outline of his equipment, making everything blend into the irregular rubble and damage that surrounded him. He appreciated that reflections from glass optics could betray a sniper's position instantly, as the flash of sunlight off a lens was unmistakable and immediately drew attention. He shaded his scope carefully, constructing a hood from dark fabric that prevented light from striking the objective lens. He positioned himself so that the sun was never directly behind him, where it could shine through his scope. On bright days, he sometimes abandoned his telescopic sight entirely and shot with iron sights rather than risk the telltale reflection. Every detail of his fieldcraft was refined through experience and observation. He learned that British uniform color was slightly lighter than German field grey, making it more visible against dark backgrounds. When operating in exposed positions, he sometimes covered himself with a piece of German tent canvas he had salvaged, blending in with the earth tones of the battlefield better than his British uniform would. He paid attention to sounds, knowing that the metallic click of a rifle bolt being worked could carry hundreds of yards in quiet conditions. He learned to work his actions slowly and carefully, minimizing noise that might alert attentive German listeners. One innovation that proved particularly effective was his use of dummy positions. He would set up obvious-looking sniper posts in the trenches, complete with loopholes and firing rests, but never actually use them. German snipers and artillery would expend considerable effort destroying these dummies, while the real sniper worked unmolested from his hidden positions in the rear. This deception served dual purposes. It drew enemy attention away from genuine threats, and it wasted German ammunition and effort on worthless targets. He constructed these dummies with care, making them look convincingly like occupied positions. He would position a helmet on a stick behind the loophole, creating the suggestion of a soldier observing from that position. He sometimes arranged for another soldier to create movement or sound near the dummy position at predictable times, reinforcing the illusion that it was actively used. German snipers would often spend hours watching these positions, waiting for an opportunity to shoot the British sniper they believed occupied them, never realizing they were wasting time on an empty decoy. The sniper also recognized the value of psychological warfare beyond simple casualty infliction. He deliberately targeted German soldiers who appeared to be leaders or who were trying to restore morale after his previous attacks. He observed that killing an officer who was attempting to calm his men or organize a response had far more impact than killing a random soldier. The loss of visible leadership at a critical moment multiplied the psychological effect of the physical casualty. He noted that precisely timed shots created maximum psychological impact. Killing a replacement sentry within seconds of him taking up his post sent a clear message that no one was safe and that the unseen enemy could strike at any moment. Shooting a soldier who had just survived a dangerous task and was probably relaxing with relief at having completed it safely demonstrated that there was no moment of security, no time when one could let down one's guard. These calculated demonstrations of omnipresence and omniscience created a climate of fear that affected German morale far beyond the actual body count he achieved. The cattle shed position continued to produce results over the following weeks, though never again quite matching the spectacular performance of that first 6-minute engagement. The sniper used it judiciously, never more than twice in a single week, and never on consecutive days. Each session added to his tally of confirmed kills and reinforced the Germans' fear of exposing themselves in that sector. The psychological impact spread beyond the immediate area, as German soldiers rotated through the position and carried stories of the invisible marksman to other sectors, spreading fear and caution throughout the German lines opposite this section of the British front. German counter-sniper efforts intensified as they recognized they were facing an unusually capable opponent. They increased patrols searching for sniper positions in the British rear areas, sending out reconnaissance parties under cover of darkness to investigate suspicious structures and terrain features. They assigned their best marksmen to watch for any sign of activity from the cattle shed area, hoping to catch the British sniper in a moment of carelessness. They even attempted to infiltrate listening posts closer to British lines from which they could better observe rear area positions. The Germans brought in specialized counter-sniper teams equipped with sophisticated optical instruments and powerful rifles. These teams set up carefully concealed observation posts from which they watched the British lines for hours, searching for the telltale signs of sniper activity, scope reflections, muzzle flash, movement in firing positions. They coordinated with artillery observers to ensure that any suspected sniper position could be engaged rapidly with concentrated fire before the sniper could escape. They even attempted to destroy the building entirely with concentrated artillery fire, dedicating an entire battery of 77mm field guns to the task of reducing the cattle shed to complete rubble. The bombardment lasted for 20 minutes and expended hundreds of rounds, pulverizing what remained of the structure and creating a landscape of shattered stone and splintered timber. The Germans assumed that no sniper position could survive such concentrated fire and that the problem had been solved through overwhelming application of high explosive. The artillery bombardment actually worked to the sniper's advantage in some ways. The additional damage to the cattle shed made it look even more destroyed and less likely to be occupied. The crater field created by the shelling provided additional concealment for approaching and leaving the position. The Germans seemed to assume that the structure was now too damaged to be useful, which made the sniper's continued use of it even more effective. He adapted his positions within the building to work around the new damage, finding that the Germans had actually created additional firing slits and observation points without realizing it. The fresh rubble provided excellent material for constructing improved firing rests and for creating multiple alternative positions. The sniper actually appreciated the German artillery attention because it demonstrated that he had gotten inside their heads, that they were expending significant resources trying to eliminate a single marksman. The fact that they were shelling an empty building was deeply satisfying, as it meant their countermeasures were based on timing and prediction rather than actual observation of his presence. Other British snipers began adopting similar tactics, identifying positions in the rear areas that offered long-range shots at German positions. The cattle shed sniper's success had demonstrated a principle that spread throughout the British sniper community. Conventional positions were expected and countered, but unconventional positions that violated traditional doctrine could be devastatingly effective if properly employed. This insight influenced British sniper tactics for the remainder of the war and contributed to the eventual British superiority in the sniper duel on the Western Front. Sniper schools began teaching the principles the cattle shed sniper had demonstrated: the value of rear area positions, the importance of patient observation before shooting, the necessity of unpredictable patterns, and the effectiveness of psychological warfare against enemy morale. His techniques were incorporated into the formal curriculum, and instructors used his 6-minute engagement as a case study in effective sniper employment. Students analyzed what he had done right, how he had prepared his position, why his tactics had proven so effective, and how similar successes might be achieved in their own sectors. The 9 kills in 6 minutes remained the sniper's most spectacular single achievement, but his overall effectiveness over time was equally impressive. Records suggest he achieved over 50 confirmed kills from the cattle shed position alone over the months he used it, with total career kills estimated at over 200. These numbers made him one of the most successful British snipers of the war, though his name remained deliberately obscure to protect him from German retaliation and to maintain the psychological advantage of fighting an unknown, invisible enemy. The nature of sniper warfare on the Western Front was inherently anonymous. Unlike the fighter pilots whose exploits were publicized and celebrated, snipers worked in secrecy and shadow. Their effectiveness depended on remaining unknown, on being ghosts that haunted enemy trenches without ever being seen or identified. The most successful snipers were often those whose names were never recorded, whose achievements were documented only in enemy casualty lists and in the whispered fears of soldiers who faced them. This anonymity served important purposes. Beyond protecting individual snipers, it created an atmosphere where the enemy never knew exactly how many snipers they faced or where those snipers might be positioned. A single highly effective sniper could create the impression of dozens of marksmen because his victims could not know they were all being killed by the same man. The psychological effect multiplied beyond the actual physical threat, forcing enemy soldiers to take extensive precautions even when no sniper was actually present. The Germans in this sector became so cautious about exposure that their operational effectiveness declined measurably, with routine tasks taking longer and requiring more personnel because no one would risk standing exposed even briefly. The cattle shed sniper understood and exploited this psychological dimension. He varied his tactics deliberately to create maximum uncertainty. Sometimes he would fire single shots at long intervals, making the Germans think a cautious, patient marksman was at work who took only the most certain shots. Other times, he would fire rapid strings of shots like his famous 6-minute engagement, suggesting an aggressive, skilled shooter who was confident enough to maintain a high rate of fire despite the risks. By changing his approach, he prevented the Germans from developing effective counter-tactics because they could never be sure what pattern he would follow or what rules governed his behavior. The ethical dimensions of sniping were complex and troubled some soldiers. Killing from concealment, shooting men who could not see you and had no chance to fight back, violated traditional notions of honorable combat that had governed warfare for centuries. Some soldiers viewed snipers as murderers rather than warriors, as men who killed without risk and without giving their victims a sporting chance to defend themselves. This attitude was particularly prevalent among officers educated in the gentlemanly traditions of warfare that emphasized courage, visibility, and direct confrontation with one's enemies. The snipers themselves generally rejected this characterization, arguing that they were simply using the most effective means available to accomplish their mission of weakening the enemy and protecting friendly forces. They pointed out that warfare had never been fair or sporting, and that seeking advantage over one's enemy was the fundamental principle of all military tactics. Artillery killed from miles away, machine guns slaughtered men who never saw the gunners, aircraft dropped bombs on soldiers who could not fight back. Why should snipers be held to a different standard than these other weapons systems? The cattle shed sniper rarely discussed his feelings about his work, but his actions suggested he viewed sniping as a craft to be perfected rather than a moral dilemma to be agonized over. He approached each shot with professional detachment, focusing on the technical challenges of making accurate hits at long range rather than on the human cost of his success. This emotional distance was probably necessary for maintaining effectiveness, as dwelling on the humanity of one's targets would make the work psychologically unbearable for most people. Yet there were limits even for professional snipers. The unwritten rules of Western Front sniping generally prohibited shooting medical personnel identifiable by Red Cross insignia, chaplains recognizable by their religious symbols, or soldiers who were obviously wounded and helpless. These rules were not always observed, and violations occurred on both sides, but most snipers adhered to them as a matter of professional pride and perhaps as a way of maintaining some moral boundaries in a war that seemed increasingly devoid of moral constraint. The cattle shed sniper apparently followed these conventions, as evidenced by his restraint when the German medical orderly appeared during his famous engagement. He focused his fire on combat soldiers, and particularly on leaders whose death would have maximum tactical impact. This selectivity suggested that while he had become comfortable with killing as a military necessity, he maintained ethical boundaries that distinguished military targets from non-combatants, even in the morally murky environment of total war. The relationship between snipers and the infantry they supported was sometimes strained. Infantry soldiers appreciated the casualties snipers inflicted on the enemy and valued the intelligence snipers gathered through their patient observation of enemy positions, but they also resented the attention and retaliation that sniper activity attracted. A sniper who killed a German officer from a section of trench would often draw artillery fire on that section, endangering the infantry occupying it. This created tension between the snipers, who saw their work as strategically valuable, and the infantry, who bore the immediate consequences of that work. The cattle shed position partially mitigated this problem because it was far enough from the front line that retaliation against it did not directly endanger frontline infantry. When the Germans shelled the cattle shed, they were expending ammunition on an empty rear area rather than on occupied trenches full of soldiers. This made the position popular with infantry commanders who appreciated its effectiveness without suffering its consequences. The sniper had found a solution that maximized tactical benefit while minimizing collateral risk to friendly forces, earning him the gratitude and support of the infantrymen he was ostensibly supporting. The story of the cattle shed sniper and his devastating 6-minute engagement spread far beyond his immediate unit. It was told and retold in training schools where new snipers learned their craft, becoming a parable about the value of creative thinking and thorough preparation. It appeared in lectures on innovative tactics and the importance of questioning conventional wisdom when circumstances warranted new approaches. It became part of the oral tradition of British sniping, a story that illustrated how one man with skill, determination, and vision could achieve results that seemed impossible according to established doctrine. The tactical innovations the sniper pioneered influenced British sniper doctrine for the remainder of World War I and beyond. The recognition that rear area positions could be more effective than frontline posts under certain circumstances became incorporated into sniper training, with instructors teaching students to think creatively about position selection rather than automatically defaulting to conventional trench positions. The emphasis on patient observation before shooting, on detailed record keeping to understand weapon performance under varying conditions, and on psychological warfare through unpredictable targeting patterns all became standard elements of British sniper methodology. One man's creative solution to a tactical problem had contributed to systemic improvement across the entire sniper community. His willingness to experiment, to trust his analysis despite criticism, and to validate his methods through results rather than arguments created a template that other snipers followed. The British sniper program, which had started the war behind German standards, had by 1917 achieved parity and was moving toward superiority largely through this kind of innovative thinking and tactical evolution. The Germans eventually identified the general area from which the deadly fire was coming and made the cattle shed a priority target for destruction. Concentrated artillery fire eventually reduced it to complete rubble, eliminating it as a useful position and denying the British sniper this particular advantage. But by that time, the sniper had accomplished his purpose. He had proven his concept, had inflicted significant casualties, had trained other snipers in his methods, and had moved on to other positions and other innovations. The destruction of the cattle shed was a tactical victory for the Germans, but a strategic irrelevance because the principles it represented had already spread throughout British forces. Multiple snipers were now employing similar tactics in different sectors, using rear area positions that the Germans had not thought to watch carefully. The cat was out of the bag, and the Germans found themselves forced to expand their counter-sniper efforts to cover much larger areas, diluting their effectiveness and allowing British snipers to operate with greater freedom than they had previously enjoyed. The sniper himself survived the war, defying the odds that claimed so many of his comrades. Records of his post-war life are fragmentary, as many veterans of that conflict sought to forget their experiences and rebuild their lives without dwelling on the horrors they had endured. He apparently returned to his pre-war occupation as a gamekeeper, applying the same patient observation and intimate understanding of terrain that had made him an effective sniper to the more peaceful pursuit of managing wildlife on a country estate. He rarely spoke of his wartime service, a reticence common among combat veterans who preferred to leave their experiences on the battlefield rather than carrying them into civilian life. When pressed, he would sometimes share technical details about shooting or fieldcraft, but he avoided discussing the human cost of his effectiveness or the psychological burden of having killed so many men. Like many snipers, he had compartmentalized his wartime activities, treating them as a necessary job that had required doing, but that did not define who he was as a person. The 9 kills in 6 minutes remained a benchmark achievement in British sniper lore for decades after the war, a demonstration of what was possible when skill, preparation, and opportunity converged perfectly. Modern snipers, equipped with far more sophisticated weapons and optics than their World War I predecessors, still find the achievement impressive when they consider the limitations under which it was accomplished. Making 9 consecutive hits at 400 to 500 yards with a bolt-action rifle equipped with a primitive 3-power telescopic sight under field conditions with variable wind and light, while the enemy was actively trying to locate and suppress the shooter, represented marksmanship of the highest order. The broader lessons of the cattle shed sniper's story extended beyond sniping techniques to fundamental principles of warfare and innovation applicable to any field of human endeavor. His experience demonstrated that unconventional approaches, when based on sound analysis and proper preparation, could achieve results that conventional methods could not match. He showed that ridicule and skepticism from peers should not deter someone who had confidence in their reasoning and their skills, and that results ultimately speak louder than criticism. He proved that individual initiative and creative thinking remained valuable even in the industrialized mass warfare of the Western Front, where individual soldiers often felt powerless in the face of artillery and machine guns that dominated the battlefield and reduced human beings to statistics in casualty reports. His success reminded everyone that warfare remained fundamentally a human endeavor, and that individual excellence, properly applied, could still make a significant difference in the outcome of battles and campaigns. The story also highlighted the importance of being willing to violate established doctrine when circumstances warranted. Military organizations tend toward conservatism, favoring proven methods over untested innovations, because consistency and reliability are usually more important than brilliance in military operations. This conservatism serves important purposes, preventing the adoption of ineffective tactics and maintaining cohesion across large organizations operating under stress. But it can also stifle innovation, and prevent the recognition of better approaches when conditions change or when new technologies create new possibilities. The cattle shed sniper succeeded because he was willing to trust his own judgment over the conventional wisdom of his peers, and because his preparations were thorough enough to validate his unconventional approach when given the chance to prove itself. He understood that earning the right to deviate from doctrine required being absolutely certain of one's analysis and being prepared to back up that analysis with flawless execution. His success earned him not just respect, but also the freedom to continue innovating as commanders recognized that his judgment was sound even when it contradicted standard practice. The psychological dimensions of his achievement were as significant as the tactical ones. The fear he instilled in German soldiers facing his sector forced them to alter their behavior in ways that reduced their combat effectiveness significantly. Simple tasks like relieving sentries, distributing rations, or repairing trenches became fraught with danger and required elaborate precautions that consumed time and resources. The inspiration he provided to British snipers improved morale and encouraged others to develop their own innovative tactics rather than simply following the manual. The respect he earned from initially skeptical peers demonstrated the power of results to overcome prejudice and resistance to new ideas. The soldiers who had mocked his cattle shed sniper slit became his most ardent supporters once they saw what it could accomplish, and several of them worked with him to develop similar positions elsewhere along the line. This transformation from critic to collaborator illustrated how innovation spreads when given the chance to prove itself, and how open-minded professionals will embrace new methods when those methods demonstrate superior results. In the broader context of World War I, individual achievements like those of the cattle shed sniper were drops in an ocean of industrial slaughter. The war consumed millions of lives and reshaped the world in ways that no individual soldier could significantly influence through their actions on the battlefield. The grand sweep of history was determined by economics, politics, technology, and national will, rather than by individual heroism or skill, no matter how exceptional. Yet these individual stories remain important because they illustrate the human dimension of the conflict, and because they demonstrate that even in the most mechanized and depersonalized warfare, individual skill and courage still mattered to those who witnessed them. The soldiers who served alongside the cattle shed sniper drew inspiration from his achievements, finding in his success proof that individual excellence and creative thinking could still make a difference, even when everything seemed to reduce to meaningless attrition and statistical casualty rates. The cattle shed itself, reduced to rubble during the war, has long since disappeared from the landscape. The farmland where it stood has been plowed and replanted countless times over the past century. The shell craters filled in, the trenches smoothed over, the wire obstacles removed and recycled. The physical landscape bears little evidence of the terrible events that occurred there, and visitors to the area today would find it difficult to imagine the moonscape of destruction that characterized the Western Front during the war. But the story endures, passed down through generations of snipers and military historians, a reminder of what one skilled individual could achieve with a good rifle, a well-chosen position, and the determination to prove that innovation could triumph over convention. The tale has been told in sniper schools from Britain to the United States, from Canada to Australia, wherever military marksmen gather to learn their craft and to draw inspiration from those who came before them. For those who study the art and science of sniping, the cattle shed sniper represents an ideal, the thinking marksman who combines technical skill with tactical creativity to achieve results beyond what conventional approaches would allow. His careful preparation, his attention to detail, his patient observation, and his disciplined fire represent the attributes that distinguish truly exceptional snipers from merely competent ones. The 6 minutes that brought him fame were the culmination of years of development as a marksman and weeks of specific preparation for that position, demonstrating that excellence results from sustained effort rather than momentary inspiration. The transformation from mockery to respect that characterized his peers' response to his achievement reflects a truth about innovation in any field. Skepticism greets new approaches until results prove their value. The soldiers who laughed at the cattle shed sniper slit were not fools. They were experienced men applying conventional wisdom based on what had worked in the past. Their skepticism was reasonable given that most innovations fail, and that unconventional approaches usually fail for good reasons. The sniper's achievement was not just in shooting accurately, but in seeing possibilities that experience had blinded others to recognizing, and in having the confidence to pursue those possibilities despite criticism. Modern military snipers still study World War I sniping techniques and tactics, finding relevant lessons despite the century of technological advancement that separates contemporary marksmen from their predecessors. The fundamental challenges remain similar: how to observe the enemy without being observed, how to engage targets accurately at extended ranges, how to maximize psychological impact while minimizing physical exposure, how to survive in an environment where the enemy is actively trying to kill you. The Cattle Shed sniper's solutions to these challenges, while specific to his time and place, illustrate principles that remain valid in contemporary warfare. The story serves as a reminder that warfare, despite its mechanization and industrialization, remains fundamentally a human endeavor, where human qualities like intelligence, creativity, skill, and determination ultimately determine outcomes. Technology provides tools and capabilities, but human intelligence and creativity determine how effectively those tools are employed and what advantages they can create. The Cattle Shed sniper had essentially the same rifle as thousands of other British soldiers, but he used it far more effectively because of his superior skill, his creative thinking, and his meticulous preparation. The weapon was merely a tool. The true weapon was the man wielding it and the mind that directed his actions. In the final analysis, the tale of the Cattle Shed sniper and his 9 kills in 6 minutes is a story about the triumph of preparation over improvisation, of innovation over convention, and of individual excellence over mass mediocrity. It is a story about refusing to accept limitations that others took for granted, and about proving through results that unconventional approaches could deliver conventional victories when properly conceived and executed. It is a story about how ridicule can transform into respect when skill meets opportunity, and delivers undeniable success that cannot be dismissed or explained away. The cattle shed that housed his position may be long gone, erased by a century of peace and reconstruction that has healed the scars the war left on the landscape. The man who cut that despised sniper slit has certainly been dead for many decades, his name lost to history along with those of countless other soldiers who served and sacrificed without recognition or reward beyond the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. But the story persists because it embodies truths about courage, innovation, and excellence that transcend its specific historical context and speak to universal human experiences. It reminds us that one person with skill, determination, and creative vision can make a difference even in circumstances that seem to render individual effort meaningless. It teaches us that skepticism from others should not deter us from pursuing approaches we believe in, provided we are willing to do the hard work of validating those approaches through thorough preparation and flawless execution. It demonstrates that respect must be earned through results rather than demanded through rhetoric, and that the transformation from mockery to admiration is one of the sweetest victories anyone can achieve. 9 Germans dropped in 6 minutes, each killed by a single precisely placed shot from a position everyone had dismissed as worthless. That achievement, and the story of the innovative thinking that made it possible, deserves to be remembered and celebrated as an example of what human excellence can accomplish when given the chance. It stands as testament to what can be achieved when someone refuses to accept conventional limitations and possesses the skill and determination to prove that their vision was correct. The laughter that greeted the cattle shed sniper slit faded quickly, replaced by respect that has endured for over a century and that continues to inspire snipers and soldiers today. That transformation, from mockery to admiration, from ridicule to respect, is perhaps the most lasting victory the sniper achieved, more enduring even than the tactical success of that remarkable 6 minutes when he demonstrated that innovation, skill, and courage could combine to accomplish the seemingly impossible.